The moment Hugh Sheridan read that telegram, his hands went still as a held breath, because the words written on that thin strip of paper represented everything he had worked toward for the last 9 years. And the only problem was that saying yes meant leaving behind the one woman he had never been able to stop thinking about. The year was 1883, and the sun-baked town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat just north of the Kishom Trail like a proud and weary sentry. It was the kind of town that smelled of cattle dust and sawdust in equal measure, where the boardwalks groaned under the boots of trail hands, and the saloon on the corner of Main and Elm stayed lit until the small hours of the morning. Caldwell had seen its share of rough men and hard seasons, but it had also softened around the edges in recent years as more families put down roots, as churches went up beside saloons, and as women like Myrtle Bell planted flower boxes in their windowsills and made the place feel like somewhere worth staying. Hugh had ridden into Caldwell 3 years prior with nothing but a good horse, a solid reputation as one of the finest cattle drovers in the state, and a weathered saddlebag that held more memories than possessions. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and pale gray eyes that had a way of seeing through a man's pretense and straight into his intentions. He was not the kind of man who talked much, but when he did, people listened, and that quality had served him well in the cattle business, where fortunes rose and fell on the strength of a handshake and the honesty behind it. He had taken a position as head drover for a mid-sized operation owned by a cattle baron named Elias Coombs, and he had spent the better part of 3 years pushing longhorns up and down the trail, sleeping under open skies, and saving every dollar he could toward the dream of one day owning a small spread of his own. He was methodical and patient, the way a man must be when the land does not give up its rewards without a fight, and he had built a quiet life in Caldwell that suited him well enough. He had met Myrtle Bell on his 3rd day in town. She had been standing in front of the general store, arguing with the proprietor, a round-faced man named Denton, over the weight of a sack of flour she had purchased the week before. She was not arguing loudly or with any dramatic flourish. She was simply standing her ground with a calm, clear voice and a look in her dark eyes that said she knew exactly what a full 20-pound sack of flour felt like, and what she had been sold was not it. Denton had blustered and tried to redirect the conversation 3 different times, and each time Myrtle had brought it right back to the matter at hand, with the patience of someone who had dealt with slippery reasoning before and found it tiresome. Hugh had stopped walking on the boardwalk just outside the door, partly because he needed tobacco and partly because something in her voice had caught him the way a melody catches you through a thin wall when you are not even trying to hear music. He had stood there longer than was strictly necessary, watching her win the argument with dignity and without cruelty, and when she had walked out with both her money and her proper flour, she had glanced at him briefly with those dark eyes and said, simply, "Are you waiting to go inside, or are you practicing being a fence post?" He had laughed. It was the first real laugh he could remember having in months, and it startled him with its sincerity. That had been the beginning. Myrtle Bell was 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of fever 2 winters before Hugh arrived in Caldwell, and a mother who had passed when Myrtle was 12. She had been keeping house and keeping herself since then with a stubbornness that impressed even the most self-sufficient women in town. She worked 3 mornings a week helping the local physician, a tired but kind man named Dr. Aldrich, with his patient records and the cleaning of his instruments, because she had a steady hand and an unflappable nature that made her useful around things that turned other people queasy. On the afternoons when she was not at the doctor's office, she took in mending and alterations, her needle moving through fabric with the same precision and calm that she brought to every other aspect of her life. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped a room, though she was lovely in the way that stayed with you, the way a particular shade of evening sky stays with you long after dark has come. She had warm brown skin and black hair that she wore pinned up during the day, though at the end of a long evening it always seemed to be working its way loose in tendrils around her face, and dark eyes that held humor and depth in equal measure. She was practical in her dress and generous in her manner, and she had a way of making people feel heard that the town had come to rely on without quite realizing how much. Hugh had not rushed things between them. He was not a man who rushed anything. He had found reasons to pass the general store at the same time each morning, had tipped his hat and exchanged words about the weather and the state of the road south, had offered to carry her parcels when she was loaded down, and had not lingered past the point of welcome. He had shown up at the church social in September and asked her to dance once, and only once, and he had danced well enough that she had not regretted saying yes. He had fixed the broken step on the front porch of her small rented house one Saturday morning, not because she had asked him to, but because he had seen her nearly twist her ankle on it the day before, and the sight of her stumbling had produced in his chest a sensation that he recognized as the specific, inconvenient panic of caring about someone's safety. It had taken him the better part of a year to admit to himself that he was in love with Myrtle Bell, and another 6 months after that to begin to understand that she might feel something in return. The evidence had been subtle, in the way that honest things often are. She had started saving him a piece of whatever she baked on Sundays and leaving it at the livery stable where he sometimes did additional work, wrapped in cloth with no note because she knew he knew it was from her. She had stopped correcting the direction he was going when he offered to walk her home from the doctor's office, even on the evenings when he was clearly heading out of his way to do so. She had started telling him things, small things and large things, about her father and her mother, and the particular quality of loneliness that comes from being entirely self-reliant, and she only told things like that to people she trusted. By the spring of 1883, the people of Caldwell had largely stopped wondering whether Hugh Sheridan and Myrtle Bell would find their way toward each other, and had started simply waiting with the fond anticipation of people watching a good story progress at its own pace. And then the telegram arrived. Hugh was at Elias Coombs's office when it came, having ridden in from the southern pasture with a report on the condition of the herd. The telegraph boy knocked on the door with the missive, and Coombs read it first with his eyebrows climbing steadily toward his hairline, and then handed it across the desk to Hugh without a word. It was from a man named Wallace Granger, the owner of the largest cattle operation in Texas, based out of San Antonio. Granger was the kind of name that carried weight in every saloon and livestock office from the Rio Grande to the Northern Territories. The telegram read, "Have heard considerable word of your skill and reputation. Stop. Offer position of trail boss and range manager for GRANGER cattle. Stop. Salary of $1,200 annual plus percentage of herd profit. Stop. Position. Begin September 1st. Stop. Require your answer by July 15. Stop. GRANGER. $1,200 a year, plus a percentage of the herd profit." For a man who had been earning $350 annually under Coombs and counting every cent, the figure on that telegram was not simply generous. It was the kind of number that represented an entirely different life. It was the number that meant he could buy his own land within a few years. It meant security of the kind he had never known. It meant every 9 years of riding and working and proving himself had finally produced the result he had been quietly, stubbornly working toward. It also meant moving to San Antonio, Texas, a distance of some 600 miles from Caldwell, Kansas. Hugh had folded the telegram carefully and placed it in his breast pocket and told Coombs he would think on it. And Coombs, who was a fair man and understood what kind of offer this was, had simply nodded and said he was sorry to be losing him but would not insult him by suggesting he turn it down. Hugh had ridden back toward town that evening with the telegram sitting against his chest like a coal pulled fresh from the fire. He had stopped his horse at the edge of the ridge that overlooked Caldwell, the place where the trail dipped and then leveled out, and you could see the whole town laid out below you in the amber and rose of a Kansas sunset. He could see the church steeple, the saloon's lamp already burning, the neat little row of houses on the eastern side of town where Myrtle lived. He could see the doctor's office with its small painted sign. He could see all of it, the place he had come to without intending to stay and had stayed in without intending to love, and he knew without pretending otherwise that what held him here was not the town itself. He did not go to see her that evening. He needed to think, and thinking clearly around Myrtle Bell had always required more discipline than he usually possessed. He spent the night in the bunkhouse at Coombs's ranch and lay awake on top of the blankets in the warm June dark, and laid out the situation in his mind with the same methodical care he brought to planning a cattle drive. The facts were plain. The Granger contract was the best opportunity of his life. Nothing remotely like it would come again. A man in his position did not refuse Wallace Granger. On the other side of the ledger sat the singular fact that he was in love with Myrtle Bell in a way that felt less like a choice and more like a geographical feature of himself, like a ridge or a river, simply there, part of the landscape of who he was. He had not told her plainly. He was not certain she knew the full weight of what he felt. They had been circling each other for 3 years with the careful slowness of people who had both been hurt by loss and did not want to reach for something and find it gone. He thought about her voice correcting Denton in that general store. He thought about the wrapped piece of pie left at the livery without a note. He thought about the one evening in February when a storm had come in fast and cold, and she had been walking home from the doctor's office without a proper coat, and he had ridden up alongside her and swung down and put his coat around her shoulders without asking, and she had looked up at him in the gray stormlight with an expression that had stopped his breath completely. Neither of them had said anything at all. He had walked his horse, and they had walked together through the snow in silence, and it had been one of the finest evenings of his life. He was still awake when the first pale color came into the sky. By morning he had not resolved anything, but he had arrived at the certainty that he could not make this decision without being honest with her. Not because it was her decision to make, but because pretending she was not a factor in it would have been the worst kind of cowardice, and Hugh Sheridan, whatever his faults, was not a coward. He went to find her that morning. She was in her front yard taking in laundry from the line before the day got too hot, her hair still pinned from the night before but already beginning its migration toward freedom, a basket of white cotton at her feet. She saw him coming up the path and read something in his face immediately because she was the kind of woman who paid attention to things. "You look like you did not sleep," she said, and her voice had that particular gentle directness that he had spent 3 years learning to love. "I did not," he said. She set down the sheet she had been folding and gave him her full attention. "What has happened?" He told her about the telegram. He told her plainly, the figures, the offer, the distance, all of it. He did not soften any part of it. He stood in her front yard with his hat in his hands and told her exactly what had arrived and what it meant, and he watched her face carefully because he had learned to read it the way a trail hand reads the sky. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished. A crow called from somewhere down the street. The morning was already warm with the particular heavy warmth of a Kansas June. "That is a tremendous offer," she said at last. "It is," he agreed. "And you came to tell me about it." She said it without a question mark at the end, as a statement, because she was already working out what it meant that he was here rather than simply sending a reply to Granger's telegram. "I came to tell you about it," he said, "because I could not think clearly enough to know what to do without talking to you, and when I examined why I could not think clearly, the answer turned out to be because I care more about what happens in Caldwell than I care about what happens in San Antonio, and the reason for that is you, Myrtle." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands, which had been very still at her sides, moved slightly, as though she had considered reaching for something and then changed her mind. "You have known that for a while," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have." "So have I," she said, and the words were quiet and deliberate, and they landed in his chest like something that had been falling for a long time finally arriving at its destination. He took a step toward her, and then stopped himself, because there was still the matter of the contract on the table, and he was not a man who would let a woman's feelings for him be the thing that prevented him from asking the right question. "I need you to understand that I am not asking you to tell me what to do. I am telling you that I know what I want, and I wanted to know if what I want is something you might want too, before I make a decision that closes a door permanently." She studied his face for another moment. Then she said, "What exactly are you asking me, Hugh?" He exhaled. "I am asking you if there is a future here between us, a real one, not the dancing around it we have been doing for 3 years. Because if there is, then what I want to do with my life is build it here with you. And if there is not, then I should take the contract and go, because staying here pining like a fool when you do not want what I want would be no good for either of us." Myrtle Bell was not the kind of woman who dissembled when the moment called for honesty. She picked up the corner of the sheet she had set down and folded it once precisely and set it in the basket, and then she looked at him directly and said, "I have been hoping for a year that you would say something like that. I was beginning to think I would have to say it myself, which I was perfectly willing to do but would have appreciated not having to." He laughed again, the way he had the very first time, with that same startled sincerity. "So there is a future," he said. "There is a future," she confirmed. "But Hugh, I need you to hear me on something. I will not be the thing that costs you this. I have been the reason for my own choices my whole life, and I can manage that, but I will not be the reason a man of your quality passes up something he has earned. If you take that contract and go to San Antonio, I will still be here when your term is done. I am not going anywhere." He shook his head slowly. 3 years is a long time to ask you to wait." "I have been waiting already," she said simply. "At least now I would know what I was waiting for." "And if I stayed," he said. "Then you would need to decide that for yourself," she said. "Not for me. I would not carry the weight of that decision well, Hugh. I want you to choose what is right for your life, and then I want us to figure out what life looks like together from there." He left her that morning without a resolution, and she let him go without pressing for one, which was one of the many things about her that made him love her as completely as he did. He spent the next 2 weeks in a state that his bunkmate, a wiry and good-natured drover named Pete Holloway, described as like watching a man try to read a map that keeps changing languages. Hugh rode out on the range and did his work, and came back in the evenings, and sat on the fence at the edge of the corral and thought. He wrote a long letter to his older brother Robert back in Missouri, explaining the situation with the kind of careful detail that he gave to things that mattered, and Robert wrote back with characteristic practicality. "A man can find a good position again if he is as good as you say you are. He does not always find a good woman, but you are the only one who knows which of those things you believe." It was not exactly advice, but it was honest, and Hugh appreciated honest more than advice. He rode out to the southern pasture one afternoon and sat his horse on the rise and looked at the land, the long rolling grass brown and gold in the July heat, the sky immense above it. He thought about San Antonio, about a position that would let him save enough in 3 years to buy his own spread. He thought about Myrtle saying, "I will still be here when your term is done." He thought about 3 years in Texas, 600 miles from the sound of her voice. He thought about the morning he had walked his horse through the snow beside her in silence, and how it had been one of the finest evenings of his life. He rode back to town and went directly to the telegraph office and sent his reply to Wallace Granger. The man at the telegraph desk, a young fellow named Cooper who was perpetually curious about other people's business, watched Hugh write out the message and could not help glancing at it as he coded it for transmission. His eyebrows rose considerably. He looked at Hugh and then back at the message. "You sure about that, Mr. Sheridan?" "Send it," Hugh said, and laid his coin on the counter. The message to Granger read, Grateful for your offer and your confidence. Stop after considerable reflection. AM, unable to accept position. AT this time. Stop, have obligations in Caldwell, that I am not willing to leave. Stop, wish you well in your operation. Stop, Sheridan. He walked out of the telegraph office and stood on the boardwalk in the July sun, and felt the decision settle into him the way a stone settles into river mud, solid and complete and permanent. He had expected to feel loss, and he did feel something that was adjacent to loss, the particular ache of a door closing. But beneath that, deeper than it, was a feeling of rightness so firm it surprised him with its steadiness. He turned toward the eastern side of town and walked. Myrtle was on her porch when he arrived, as she sometimes was in the late afternoon, her mending basket beside her and a glass of water on the rail. She looked up when she heard his boots on her path, and she read his face the way she always read his face, quickly and accurately, and something in her expression shifted into something soft and careful and aware. "You sent a reply to Granger," she said. "It was not a question." "I did," he said. She set her mending down. "Hugh, I need you to know," he said, stopping at the foot of her porch steps and looking up at her, "that I did not do it because you asked me to. I did it because when I sat on that ridge and tried to imagine packing my saddlebag and riding south, I understood that everything I have been working toward for 9 years was never actually about the money or the title. It was about having a life that meant something, and the life that means something to me is here." She came down the 2 porch steps to stand level with him, and she looked at him for a long moment in that direct, searching way she had, and whatever she found in his face must have satisfied her, because she reached up and put her hand against the side of his jaw, and he turned into it the way a man turns toward warmth. "You are a stubborn, complicated man," she said. "I am," he agreed. "And I am very glad you are here," she said. He covered her hand with his. "Myrtle, I would like to court you properly if you will have it. No more dancing around things. I want to call on you and take you to supper and sit with you at church and have everyone in Caldwell understand exactly what my intentions are." She smiled, and it was not the small, careful smile she gave the world in general, but the full, unguarded one that he had seen only a handful of times, and that did something profound to the steadiness he normally prided himself on. "I thought you would never ask," she said. Summer poured itself over Caldwell with the generosity of a good year, hot and golden and smelling of dry grass and late-season wildflowers. Hugh called on Myrtle 3 evenings a week at minimum, which was about as frequently as the social customs of the time and place permitted without creating a scandal, and on Sunday mornings he sat beside her in church, and on Sunday afternoons they walked along the creek that ran east of town and talked about everything. They talked about her father and what kind of man he had been, patient and learned, and sometimes too gentle for the hard edges of the frontier. They talked about Hugh's childhood in Missouri, his mother who had died when he was 15, his brother Robert who had stayed on the family farm, while Hugh had gone west with the restlessness that had always lived in him. They talked about what they wanted about the land, about what a place of their own might look like, about children, tentatively at first and then with more ease as the weeks passed, and the space between them stopped being cautious. The town noticed, naturally. Caldwell was not a large town, and the courtship of Myrtle Bell and Hugh Sheridan was the kind of story that people followed with good-natured investment. Mrs. Aldrich, the doctor's wife, made pointed remarks about the duration of proper courtships whenever she saw Myrtle in the mercantile. Pete Holloway teased Hugh mercilessly and with great affection. Elias Coombs, who had genuinely appreciated Hugh as an employee and was relieved to have retained him, expressed his approval in the direct way of a cattle man. He offered Hugh a raise and told him that a settled man was a reliable man, and that he expected him to be in Caldwell for some years to come. The one shadow that fell across the summer was not dramatic in the way of frontier stories. No gunfighters, no desperate villains, though the frontier had those too. It was quieter and in some ways harder to address. There were people in Caldwell, and in the West generally, who held opinions about who should be with whom that had nothing to do with character or love, and everything to do with the color of a person's skin. Myrtle was not unaware of this. She had grown up navigating it with the same practical calm she brought to everything else, but that did not mean it did not land. When old Jeremiah Tate made a pointed comment at the feed store loud enough for half the street to hear, suggesting that Hugh might reconsider his choices, Hugh had stopped walking and turned to look at the man with those gray eyes that had the quality of a clear sky before weather comes in, and he had said, with great economy and complete clarity, "I will thank you to keep your opinions about my personal life in your pocket, Tate, as I have absolutely no use for them." He had then continued walking without pausing again, and Myrtle, at his side, had said nothing but had taken his arm for the first time on a public street, a small gesture that said everything she meant it to say. There were other moments like that, smaller, and Hugh faced each one the same way, with a flat and final removal of the conversation from the realm of the acceptable, and Myrtle faced them with a dignity that did not ask for anyone's approval, while quietly, unmistakably, making clear that she was not going anywhere either. By the end of summer, the town had largely come to terms with the fact that these two people were going to be part of Caldwell together, and the opinions of the Jeremiah Tates of the world had retreated to the corners where such opinions belong. In September, 3 weeks after the date on which Hugh had been due to begin his position with Granger Cattle in San Antonio, he asked Myrtle Bell to marry him. He did not do it with any great theatrical ceremony, partly because he was not a theatrical man, and partly because he had come to understand that Myrtle valued honesty over performance. He took her walking in the evening along the creek, the September air already cool and carrying the first suggestion of autumn, and he stopped on the bank where the cottonwoods were beginning to turn yellow and reached into his pocket and produced a ring that he had quietly commissioned from the jeweler in Wichita 2 weeks before, a simple band with a small garnet stone, because he had once heard her say she found garnets more interesting than diamonds, which was a very Myrtle Bell thing to say, and was one of the reasons he was standing here. He told her that he had thought about how to say this in a way that was worthy of what she was to him, and had come to the conclusion that the only way to do that was to say it plainly. That she was the wisest and most steadfast person he had ever known, that she made him understand things about himself he would not have arrived at on his own, that the 3 years he had spent learning who she was had been the best 3 years of his life, and that he wanted the rest of his life to be arranged around the same project. She did not answer him immediately. She looked at the ring and then at the river and then at him, and she said, "You are sure. You are completely sure." "I have never been more certain of anything," he said. "Because I need you to be sure," she said, with a gentleness that carried the weight of everything she did not need to explain, all the ways in which a woman in her position in 1883 understood the full dimensions of what she was being asked to step into, the vulnerabilities and the stakes and the irreversibility of it. "I need you to be a man who has looked at all of it and chosen." "I have looked at all of it," he said. "I have looked at it from every angle I can think of, and some I probably have not thought of yet, I am sure." She was quiet one moment more. Then she held out her hand, and he put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him and said, "Yes, Hugh, yes." He kissed her for the first time there on the bank of the creek in the September dusk, and it was the kind of kiss that felt like the period at the end of a very long sentence, like something finally, completely said. They were married in November, in the church on the corner of Main Street, with the whole of Caldwell seemingly present, and the walls straining to hold the warmth of that many people. Myrtle wore a dress she had made herself from a soft ivory wool, and her hair was pinned up with small dark flowers woven through it, and when she walked up the aisle on the arm of Dr. Aldrich, who was the closest thing to a father figure she had left in the world, Hugh stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and was not even slightly embarrassed by the fact that his eyes were bright. Pete Holloway served as best man, and nearly forgot to produce the second ring at the necessary moment, having been distracted by attempting to wink at a red-haired woman in the third row. Mrs. Aldrich wept with the thorough dedication of a woman who considered a good wedding her personal triumph. Elias Coombs sat in the back row with his big hands folded and nodded with the satisfied air of a man whose judgment had been confirmed. The Reverend Miles, a spare and kindly man who had been in Caldwell for 6 years and who had buried Myrtle's father, and who knew the full measure of her history with this town, married them with a warmth and an attention to the individuals in front of him that made the ceremony feel, as such things should, particular and real. Hugh and Myrtle Sheridan rode away from the church in a wagon decorated with autumn branches by the women of the town, and behind them came the noise of a celebration that lasted well into the evening. They had 3 years together that were, in all the ways that matter, genuinely good. Hugh continued his work with Coombs and expanded his responsibilities steadily, proving that Coombs's confidence had not been misplaced. Myrtle continued her work at the doctor's office and her mending, and she taught 2 afternoons a week at the schoolhouse, because the regular teacher had taken ill for a long spell, and Myrtle's father had taught her to love learning with the same urgency he had loved it himself, and the children of Caldwell benefited from both inheritances. Their little house on the eastern side of town was neat and warm and full of the particular life of 2 people who genuinely liked each other's company. In the spring of 1884, their son was born. They named him Eli, for no one in particular, but because the name had a solidity to it that suited the solid, earnest infant who arrived in Dr. Aldrich's capable hands in the pre-dawn hours of a warm April morning. Eli was red-faced and loud and entirely himself from his first breath, and Hugh held him in the early light with a look on his face that Myrtle, exhausted and luminous in the way of new mothers, filed away in the permanent collection of things she would carry to her grave. Hugh looked down at the baby and then across at Myrtle and said quietly, "Thank you." She knew he did not just mean for the baby. He meant for all of it, for the whole life they had made in this place together, and she reached over and put her hand over his where it cradled the small weight of their son, and she said, equally quietly, "There is nowhere I would rather be." Eli grew into a stout and bright-eyed little boy who was, from the beginning, a blend of both his parents in the most interesting ways. He had Hugh's gray eyes and Myrtle's bone structure, and a disposition that seemed to have arrived pre-equipped with both his father's stubbornness and his mother's patient intelligence. A combination that produced a child who would spend 20 minutes carefully working out how to open a cabinet latch rather than accept that it was beyond him, and who would greet success with a mild, satisfied expression that was so purely Myrtle that it made Hugh laugh every time. The world around Caldwell was changing through those years, as the frontier always was. The cattle trade was evolving. The railroads were reaching further, changing the routes and the calculus of the drives. New settlers were coming in, and the old wild edges of the territory were being pressed back, which brought order and also brought loss, the particular loss of a particular kind of openness that those who had known the land before its fencing could not fully explain to those who had come after. Hugh watched these changes with the attention of a man who understood that the thing he was good at was transforming under him, and he thought about the future with the same deliberate care he had always applied to things that mattered. In the spring of 1886, a letter arrived from a man named Gideon Park, a cattle operator out of Abilene who was putting together a cooperative venture to purchase and develop a large parcel of grassland 20 miles south of Caldwell. Park wanted experienced men with good judgment and a stake in the local territory, men who would invest not just their time but their own capital in the venture, and who would share in the profits accordingly. The parcel he was describing was substantial, 3,000 acres of good grass with a creek running through the southern quarter. It was not the Granger offer. It was not $1,200 a year plus percentage. What it was land. Real land, within riding distance of Caldwell, within riding distance of the life he had built, and the woman he had built it with. Hugh sat at the kitchen table in the evening and read Park's letter twice, carefully, and then laid it flat on the table and looked at it for a moment and looked at Myrtle, who was across the table from him darning a pair of Eli's socks while the 2-year-old slept in the back room. "What is it?" she said. He slid the letter across to her, and she read it through with the same careful attention she gave to everything, her hands still around the sock and the needle, her eyes moving steadily down the page. When she finished, she set it down and looked at him, and her face held something that was equal parts excitement and consideration. How much capital does he want from the participants? He has not named a final figure, needs a response first to gauge interest, then will provide the full terms. "And this land," she said, "you think it is good land?" "I have ridden that stretch," he said, "the south quarter in particular where the creek runs. It is good grass, good water. The kind of land that would support a small herd and could be built on over time." She set down the sock. "Hugh, this is what you wanted. It would take everything we have saved," he said, "and then some. It would not be comfortable for a while. We have not been pursuing comfort," she said. "We have been pursuing something specific." He looked at her steadily. "I know. Then write to Park," she said. He smiled at her, slow and certain, the way he did the things he was sure of. They wrote to Park that week, and the negotiations that followed took 3 months and were conducted with the kind of painstaking care that financial decisions in 1886 demanded. No banks in Caldwell sophisticated enough for the scale of the venture. Capital assembled through careful conversation, and the trust that came from reputation and from being known in a community. Hugh worked with Park and with 3 other investors, and with the careful advice of a land lawyer who came up from Wichita. And by August of that year, the papers were signed, and Hugh Sheridan was part owner of a working parcel of land 20 miles south of Caldwell, Kansas. On the morning the final papers were recorded, he rode the 20 miles south in the early morning and arrived at the land as the sun came fully up over the eastern horizon, and he sat his horse on the slight rise that gave you the best view of the full property, and he looked at it for a long time. 3,000 acres. The creek glinting silver in the morning light. The grass long and ripe with the weight of summer. His land, his name on the deed. He thought about the Granger telegram, about those words on that thin strip of paper that had represented everything he thought he was working toward. He thought about standing in Myrtle's front yard with his hat in his hands. He thought about the look on her face when he had walked back to her from the telegraph office. He thought about Eli's gray eyes looking up at him from a blanket in Dr. Aldrich's office on an April morning. He did not regret a single thing. The following spring they built the house. It was a proper house, built from lumber hauled up from the south, with 4 rooms and a real porch facing east so you could watch the morning come in across the grass. Hugh worked on it himself on the weekends with Pete Holloway and 2 other men from Coombs's operation, and Myrtle came out with Eli on Saturdays and walked through the rooms as they took shape, and told Hugh plainly and specifically what she wanted and where, because she was the kind of woman who knew what she wanted and had learned that saying so was more useful than pretending otherwise. He built her a kitchen with a proper worktop and a pantry with shelves because he had watched her work in the small kitchen of the rented house in town and understood that she deserved better tools than that. He built her a study off the main room with a window that faced north, because she had told him once, years ago, that her father had always said north-facing light was the best light for reading and thinking, and he had filed that away in the same place. He filed all the things she told him, permanently and with care. They moved in the October of 1887, when Eli was 3.5 and Myrtle was pregnant again, though they had not yet said so widely, carrying the fact of it between them with that particular private tenderness of early expectancy. The moving day was noisy and chaotic, and Pete broke a chair, and Eli fell in the mud and had to be cleaned up twice, and Mrs. Aldrich arrived with enough food to sustain the entire enterprise for a week. And by evening they were more or less arranged in the new house with the lamps lit, and Eli asleep in his room, and the sounds of the open prairie coming in through the windows. Hugh and Myrtle sat on the east-facing porch after the others had gone, in the dark that was not quite fully dark because the stars were enormous out here away from the lights of town, and they sat in the wooden chairs that Hugh had made himself over the winter, and they were quiet together in the comfortable way of people for whom silence is not an absence but a presence. "This is what you saw," she said eventually, "when you were riding out and looking at land and thinking. This is what you saw." "Not exactly," he said. "I had not pictured you in it then. I had not dared to." She turned her head and looked at him in the starlight. "I pictured the land," he said, "the house. But the rest of it, the part that makes it make sense, that came later. That came when I understood what I actually wanted." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When did you understand?" He thought about it. "The night in February when you almost fell on the snow," he said. "When I put my coat around you and we walked back in together. I understood it then, and I was terrified of it." She smiled, and even in the dark he could see it, because he had been learning to read her face for 7 years by now, and he could have found it in deeper dark than this. "I knew it before that," she said. "How much before?" "The day you fixed my porch step," she said. "You did not say a word about why you were doing it, you just did it. And I stood at the window and watched you and thought, that man is going to cause me a great deal of difficulty." He laughed, and it startled the quiet, and Eli stirred briefly in his room and then settled again. "Did I?" Hugh said. "Cause you difficulty?" "Considerable difficulty," she said. "Mostly the difficulty of wanting something I was not certain I could trust yet. And then watching you be the same person, consistently, until I trusted it completely." He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand in the dark and held it, the familiar weight and warmth of it, the small gold band under his thumb. "You trusted it completely," he said. "Completely," she said. The second child arrived in April of 1888, a girl this time, born at the new house because Myrtle had declined to travel into town, and Dr. Aldrich had made the 20-mile ride out in the early morning with his bag and his unhurried competence. She was a quieter baby than Eli, arriving with less noise, and looking around the room with a seriousness that suggested she was already forming opinions. They named her Cecily, after Myrtle's mother, and Eli regarded her with the watchful uncertainty of a 4-year-old, confronted with something permanent that he had not been consulted on. Then gradually, over weeks, with a possessive pride that was one of the most touching things Hugh had ever witnessed. Life on the land was not easy in the specific way that life on the frontier is not easy, not dramatically or dangerously, but constantly, in the accumulated demands of weather and stock and seasons that do not negotiate. There were dry years and hard winters, and the particular economic instability of an industry still finding its shape in a changing territory. The cattle cooperative that Hugh was part of had its difficulties too, disagreements between the partners over management and investment, a bad season in 1889 that thinned the herd and thinned the margins, and required the particular grim patience of men who had staked real things on an uncertain enterprise. Hugh carried these pressures with the same steadiness he had always carried the things he could not immediately fix, not pretending they were not there, but not being flattened by them either. He came home in the evenings and sat at the supper table with his family and was present, genuinely present, with his children and his wife, and that discipline of presence was one of the things Myrtle loved about him most. In the hard months of 1889, she had gone back to her mending work, quietly, without making much of it, bringing in additional income during the period when the land operation was thinned by the bad season. She had organized it practically, working in the evenings after the children were in bed and before Hugh came in, and when he realized what she was doing, he had felt the complicated mix of gratitude and something adjacent to shame that a proud man feels when the person he loves has quietly stepped in to fill a gap he had left, and he had said so plainly, because that was the way they talked to each other. She had listened to him and then said, equally plainly, "I am not doing this because you failed. I am doing this because this is what partners do, and I am your partner. You put down your coat in the snow, and you sent that telegram to Granger, and you built me a study with a north-facing window. The least I can do is sew a few extra seams." He had been so undone by this that he had simply sat down at the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment, and she had come and put her hand on the back of his neck the way she sometimes did when words were not quite sufficient, and that had been the end of the discussion. The land recovered. The herd recovered. The cooperative found its steadier footing as the decade turned. The early 1890s brought a relative prosperity to the Sheridan operation, not dramatic wealth, but the solid, rooted sufficiency of people who had earned what they had and knew how to hold it. They expanded the herd modestly and leased an additional 200 acres to the south of their existing parcel. Hugh brought in a hand named Torres, a quiet and skilled man from south of the Rio Grande, who proved to be one of the finest stockmen Hugh had ever worked alongside, and they built a secondary bunkhouse near the southern pasture to accommodate the additional crew needed for the expanded operation. Eli, by the time he was 8 or 9, was following his father around the property in the earnest way of a boy who wants to learn everything his father knows, and Hugh taught him with patience, and without any of the rigid expectations that had made his own childhood occasionally difficult. He taught the boy to handle a horse properly, to read weather, to understand the particular geography of the grass and the creek and the sky that made their land what it was. He also made it plain that Eli's mother was the smartest person on the property, and that any question the boy could not find the answer to through observation was worth taking to her. Myrtle had continued teaching, driving into Caldwell twice a week to keep up with the schoolhouse, which the town had come to rely on her for in the extended way that communities come to rely on individuals who do something with genuine quality. The school board had offered her a formal paid position in 1891, which was a recognition both of her ability and of a slowly shifting set of arrangements in how certain institutions in the territory were beginning to operate. She had accepted with the contained pleasure of someone who had been doing the work for years and was glad to have it acknowledged as the work it was. Dr. Aldrich had retired in 1890, and the new doctor, a young man named Dr. Emmett Walsh, who had come down from Kansas City with fresh training and slightly excessive confidence, had taken some time to earn the town's trust. Myrtle had smoothed this process in the practical way she had always smoothed difficult things, not by managing him or flattering him, but simply by being herself in the spaces where her presence helped. And Walsh, who was smart enough to recognize competence, had come to regard her assistance at the office as something close to essential. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, November of 1893, Hugh had arranged something that required the cooperation of Pete Holloway, who by now had a wife of his own, a forthright and red-haired woman named Ada, who was Myrtle's closest friend, and Torres, who had proven willing to manage the children for an evening with the serious dedication he brought to all his responsibilities. Hugh had borrowed a buckboard from Coombs, who had retired the year before and still kept good horses, and he had taken Myrtle into Caldwell for the evening. He had reserved a table at the hotel dining room, which by 1893 had expanded its ambitions considerably from the frontier establishment of a decade before, and could now offer white tablecloths and 3 courses and a bottle of wine. He had also, through a chain of arrangements that had taken him most of October, procured a small brooch from a jeweler in Wichita, a garnet set in gold, to match the ring he had put on her finger on the bank of the creek 14 years before. He had given her the brooch over dinner, and she had looked at it for a long moment and then at him and said, "You remembered the garnet." "I remember everything you say," he said. She pinned it to her dress and looked at him across the white tablecloth with those dark eyes that he had been reading for 13 years and had not finished learning. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. What do you think about when you think about the beginning, she said. Honestly, he thought about it. The porch step, he said, and the snow, and standing in your front yard with my hat in my hands, feeling like I was about to step off a cliff and hoping there was water at the bottom. She smiled. And was there? There was a great deal more than water, he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. I think about the telegram, she said. The Granger telegram. Yes, I think about the fact that you came to tell me about it before you decided, that you stood in my front yard and told me the truth about all of it, the offer and the money and what it meant, and then told me that you could not think clearly because of me. She paused. I had not been sure before that morning of what you felt. I had hoped, but I had not been sure. And then you stood there and said it plainly, and I thought, there he is. That is the man. Hugh was quiet for a moment. I almost did not come, he said. I nearly sent the acceptance to Granger and rode out without saying a word. Because I thought it was not fair to you to tell you what I felt and then leave. And what changed your mind? The same thing that changed it in February in the snow, he said. I realized that pretending you were not the whole center of it would have been dishonest, and I am not willing to be dishonest with you. I have never been willing to be dishonest with you. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. Do you ever wonder what would have happened, she said, if you had taken the contract, if you had gone? He considered this genuinely. I wonder what I would have become, he said. I think I would have been successful in the professional sense. I think I would have been good at the work. And I think I would have been the loneliest kind of successful, which is the kind where you have the things you wanted and realize they are not on their own, the things that make a life feel like a life. She nodded slowly. And now? He looked at her, at the garnet at her collar, at the slight silver that had come into her hair at the temples in the last few years, and that he privately thought made her more beautiful rather than less, at her hands around the wine glass, at the full and particular reality of her. Now I think that every decision I made that brought me to where I am was the right one, he said, including the one I was most afraid to make. She looked at him steadily, and her eyes were bright. The telegram, he confirmed. They drove home through the November dark with the horses slow and easy and the prairie enormous and quiet around them, and she sat close to him on the buckboard seat with her shoulder against his, and they did not talk much on the way home because they did not need to. The stars over Kansas in November are thick and cold and extraordinarily clear, and they watched them from the buckboard in the companionable silence of people who had learned over 10 years that not everything worth sharing needs to be said aloud. The children were both asleep when they got home, Tors having managed the evening with characteristic competence, and Tors departed with a nod and a quiet word, and left them the house and the quiet. Myrtle checked on Eli and Cecily in turn, and Hugh banked the fire, and they moved through the house in the easy parallel way of a long partnership, each knowing what the other was doing without needing to choreograph it, each necessary to the household in ways both practical and irreplaceable. When they were finally still, sitting by the banked fire with the prairie dark outside the windows, Myrtle leaned her head on Hugh's shoulder and he put his arm around her. And it was the same, and it was entirely different from the first time she had taken his arm on the street in Caldwell 10 years before. It held all of the 10 years in it, all the work and the seasons and the mornings and the children and the difficult months and the generous ones, all the conversations and the silences, and the particular accumulated weight of two people who had chosen each other completely, and had found, in that choosing, a foundation solid enough to hold everything they had built on top of it. Happy. He said, profoundly, she said. In the years that followed, the land continued to mature, and so did everything on it. Eli, at 12, was a capable and serious boy who had his mother's instinct for detail and his father's feel for the land. Cecily, at 9, was something else entirely, a bright, fierce, astonishing child who had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to support them, and who had announced at the age of 7 that she intended to be a doctor, a statement that had caused Myrtle and Hugh to exchange a look over her head that was equal parts amusement and absolute belief. Dr. Walsh, who was still in Caldwell and who had considerably improved on his early excessive confidence, had taken to letting Cecily sit in his waiting room and ask him questions on the afternoons when she came with her mother, and he had said privately to Hugh that if the girl kept it up, she might actually manage it someday, which was a generous and honest thing for a doctor in 1895 to say about a girl. Pete Holloway and Ada had 3 children of their own by this point, and the families were close enough that holidays were spent together, and the children intermingled in the easy way of children raised in each other's regular company. Ada had the same forthright nature that had attracted Pete to her initially, and which had, over the years, produced a friendship with Myrtle that was one of the genuine pleasures of both women's lives. The kind of friendship built on mutual respect and shared humor, and the frank exchange of all the things that are not spoken in more cautious company. By 1897, the cattle cooperative that Hugh had invested in over a decade before had transformed itself through the various pressures and opportunities of the changing market into a more formalized enterprise. The remaining original partners, Hugh and 2 others, along with Torres, who had by now invested his own savings into a small share of the operation, had bought out the partners who had wanted to exit, and what had been a loosely organized cooperative was now a properly structured cattle business with Hugh as the primary operating manager, and a reputation throughout the southern Kansas territory for consistent quality and honest dealing. It was not Granger cattle. It was not 1,200 a year plus percentage. It was something considerably more his own, built from the ground up on the particular land he had chosen, and it was producing, by the late 1890s, a return that exceeded what the Granger position would have provided, and that was entirely his and his family's. He thought about this sometimes with a satisfaction that had nothing smug in it. He thought about the young man who had arrived in Caldwell with a good horse and a saddlebag full of memories, and a restlessness that he had not yet understood was looking for a place to put itself down. He thought about what he had known then and what he had not known, and all the ways that the things you cannot know are the most important things there are. In the spring of 1898, Myrtle came to him one morning with a look on her face that he recognized, that particular expression of contained news that was not yet fully real. She told him she was expecting again, and they were both quiet with the surprise of it for a moment, because it had been 10 years since Cecily, and they had both quietly assumed that chapter was complete. Then Hugh had put his arms around her and held her for a long time, and she had rested against him with the specific trust of someone who has been held safely for so long that safety has stopped being a condition and become simply the nature of the relationship. The baby was born in November of 1898, 17 years after Hugh and Myrtle had first stood in a general store, and she had asked him if he was practicing being a fence post. It was a boy, round and serious and healthy, arriving in the same house that Hugh and Torres and Pete had built with lumber and Saturday mornings, the house with the east-facing porch and the north-facing window in the study. They named him James, after no one specific, but because the name had a plain and honest sound to it that felt right. Eli, at 14, was deeply interested in the new baby in the careful way of a boy who is old enough to help and young enough to find it remarkable. Cecily, at 10, was professionally curious, asking Dr. Walsh questions about the delivery process with an intensity that made Walsh laugh and Myrtle very proud. James himself was peaceful and observant from the beginning, watching the world with calm, dark eyes that were entirely his mother's. Hugh held James on the east-facing porch in the early morning of his second day of life, the way he had held Eli on an April morning 14 years before, and he looked out at the land in the November light. The grass was pale and cold, and the creek caught the early sun in the south quarter, and the sky was enormous and clear. He could hear Myrtle inside the house, her voice steady and warm, answering some question of Cecily's that involved an admirable specificity. He could hear Eli in the yard, doing the morning work he had taken on without being asked, moving through the routines of the place with the competence of a boy who was very nearly a man and who understood what was expected and why. He held his youngest son and looked at his land and let himself feel, for a full long moment, the whole weight of the life he had built. The years of driving cattle in the open dark before dawn. The bunkhouse and the wages counted carefully. The telegram on that afternoon in Elias Coombs's office. The walk to the telegraph office and the coin laid on the counter. The woman in the front yard with the flour and the laundry basket and the dark eyes that saw through everything unnecessary to the thing itself. The porch step and the snow and the ring on the bank of the creek. The house built from lumber and Saturday mornings. The children asleep in the fire banked and the stars over Kansas in November. He thought about what he had given up, because it was true that he had given something up. He had given up the Granger contract and the $1,200 a year and the title of trail boss of the largest cattle operation in Texas. He had given up a version of his life that would have been, by any reasonable measure, a success. He had walked away from the best professional opportunity of his career because accepting it had meant leaving the town where Myrtle Bell lived, and he had understood, in the deliberate way he understood things that mattered, that a life built away from her was not the life he was willing to live. What he had built instead was not a substitute. It was not a consolation or a lesser version of the thing he had declined. It was the thing itself, the real and particular and irreplaceable life that could only have been built here in this place with this woman from this specific choice. The land was his. The house was his. The business bore his name and was managed by his hand and would, in the fullness of time, pass to his children. The woman inside the house answering Cecily's questions with patient precision was his partner in the most complete sense of the word, the person without whom none of the rest of it had its full meaning. He would not have traded any of it. James made a small sound against his chest, the warm, unconscious sound of an infant completely at ease in the arms of a person he already, instinctively, trusted. Hugh looked down at him, dark eyes, Myrtle's eyes, looking up at him with that calm, unworried attention. "Good morning," Hugh said quietly, because it was a good morning and it seemed worth saying. The door opened behind him and Myrtle came out onto the porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the November cold, her hair loose around her face from the night before, her expression the particular soft, warm version of herself that she kept for private mornings. She stood beside him and looked at James, who had turned his head toward the sound of her voice the way flowers turn toward sun, a fact that produced in Hugh's chest the familiar feeling of something almost too large to hold. "How is he?" she said. "He is perfect," Hugh said, "like his mother." She looked up at him with those dark eyes and said, "Careful, if you start saying things like that I may begin to expect it regularly." "You should expect it regularly," he said. "I intend to say it regularly." She smiled and leaned into him, her shoulder against his arm, and he shifted James carefully and put his free arm around her, and they stood on the east-facing porch in the November morning, with the cold coming in across the grass and the creek catching the sun in the distance, and the sky going from pale to full blue above the edge of the prairie. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He thought about how to answer truthfully and concisely, which were sometimes competing requirements. "The telegram," he said, "the Granger telegram." She was quiet for a moment. "It comes back to you sometimes." "It does," he said, "not with regret, with gratitude, because the decision I made when I got it gave me everything I have." She put her hand against his chest, against the warmth of James wrapped between them and the steady beat of Hugh's heart. "I have thought about it too," she said. "About what would have happened if you had not come to tell me, if you had just sent the acceptance and ridden out." "I almost did," he said, for the second time in their history, and she heard it differently this time than she had heard it over the white tablecloth 10 years before, because now she had 20 years of knowing him and all the things those years had given her, and the almost was not frightening but simply true. "What stopped you?" she said. "Really?" He looked out at the land in the morning light. "You were already in everything," he said. Every thought I had about the future had you in it somewhere. I understood that honesty required me to name that, even if naming it led somewhere uncomfortable. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I am glad you are not a man who avoids uncomfortable truths. I have always found, he said, that the truth is almost always less uncomfortable than pretending otherwise. She tilted her head and looked up at him. That is the wisest thing you have ever said. Do not tell Pete, he said. He thinks I am primarily useful for fence repair. She laughed, a real laugh there in the cold morning air, and James stirred at the sound of it and then settled again, content. They stood there for a while longer, the three of them on the porch, and inside they could hear the house coming to life around them. Eli's boots on the back steps coming in from the yard, Cecily's voice asking something with her customary precision and energy, the particular warm noise of a full and inhabited life. The prairie stretched out in every direction, cold and wide and full of light, the land that Hugh had chosen instead of the road south, the land that had given them back everything they had put into it and more. By the time the morning had properly arrived, and the family had gathered around the breakfast table in the way they gathered, with the cheerful chaos of a household full of people who were used to each other and fond of each other and not particularly inclined to quiet, Hugh sat at the head of the table and looked at the faces around it and felt the same thing he had felt on the porch with the baby in his arms, that fullness, that rightness, that profound and daily sense of a life arranged correctly. Myrtle caught his eye from the other end of the table and raised an eyebrow slightly in the private language of 20 years together. He shook his head slightly, meaning nothing, meaning everything is good, meaning I was just looking at what we have. She nodded once, understanding everything, and turned to answer Cecily's latest question about the feasibility of a woman attending medical college in Kansas City. A question she answered with the same clear honesty she had always brought to questions about what was possible in a world that did not always make room for the right things. Telling Cecily the truth about the difficulty, and the truth about the fact that difficulty had never yet been a permanent barrier to someone willing to be patient and tenacious and excellent at the work. She told her that Dr. Walsh would write her a letter of recommendation if the time came, and that her grandmother's name was on the school building in Caldwell, and that there was nothing wrong with wanting something hard and working steadily toward it until it was yours. Eli listened to this from across the table with the expression of a 14-year-old boy who found his sister somewhat exhausting and his mother completely remarkable. James, in the curve of Myrtle's other arm, slept through all of it. Hugh looked at his family on a November morning in 1898 in Kansas, in the house he had built on the land he had chosen, and he understood that the life he had built was more than he had known how to imagine when he was riding into Caldwell with a saddlebag and a good horse, and a restlessness looking for somewhere to be still. The years would continue to pass, as they do, bringing with them the ordinary, extraordinary business of lives fully lived. Eli would grow into the capable and honest man his parents had raised, would take on more of the operation as Hugh got older, would eventually marry a straightforward young woman from Wichita who impressed Myrtle on first meeting, which was the only endorsement that mattered. Cecily would, in fact, pursue medicine with the tenacious precision she brought to everything, would correspond with Dr. Walsh for years after leaving Caldwell, would eventually receive training in Kansas City and return to the territory as one of the first practicing women physicians in that part of Kansas, which was the sort of outcome that made Hugh and Myrtle unreservedly proud, and that made Walsh, who had encouraged her from the beginning, quietly satisfied with his own early judgment. James would grow into a quiet, thoughtful man with a deep love of the land and a gift for growing things, who would one day expand the southern pasture into a proper garden as well as a cattle operation, an innovation his father would regard with admiring puzzlement and his mother with complete delight. Pete Holloway would grow old alongside Hugh with the comfortable reliability of a man who has been your friend through every version of who you were, and Ada would remain Myrtle's closest companion for the full length of both their lives. Torres would eventually buy his own small parcel of land adjacent to the Sheridan property and become, formally and legally, a neighbor as well as a colleague, a fact that Hugh considered one of the genuinely good outcomes of the later years of the operation. And Hugh and Myrtle themselves would grow old together in the house with the east-facing porch and the north-facing window in the study, growing old in the particular way of people who have been deeply happy, which is to say with a richness rather than a diminishment, each year adding something rather than taking it, the accumulated weight of a shared life becoming not a burden but a depth. On an evening late in the last year of the century, the year 1899, they sat on the east-facing porch as they had sat on so many evenings since the house was built, watching the last of the day come down over the Kansas prairie. The children were grown and the house was quieter now, though James was still young enough to be inside doing his lessons at the kitchen table with the particular focused silence of a boy who takes things seriously. The cattle operation was steady and managed and largely handed down. The land was what it had always been, wide and full, and given to its own rhythms. Hugh was 52 and Myrtle was 44, and the years sat on both of them honestly and well. His hair was gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from decades of squinting into prairie sun. Her hair was threaded through with silver, and she wore it differently now, looser, less confined, as though the later years of her life had given her full permission to be exactly herself. She was as beautiful to him as she had ever been, more so if he was being precise, because the woman he loved at 44 had all of the woman he had loved at 24 inside her plus 20 years of everything they had been through together, and that accumulation was not a subtraction. It was the opposite. They had been quiet for a long time when she said, "Do you remember what you said when you sent the telegram to Granger?" He thought about it. "I told him I had obligations in Caldwell that I was not willing to leave." "Obligations," she said with a faint smile. "I did not know how else to say it at the time," he said. "I was not yet in the practice of saying plainly what I meant." "You learned," she said. "You taught me," he said. She turned her head and looked at him, and he looked back at her, across the space between their chairs where they had sat through summer and winter and harvest and lean years and good years, and the births of children and the deaths of friends and all the thousand ordinary evenings that make up a life. "Are you happy?" he said. It was the same question he had asked her 10 years before, the same words on the same porch, but the question had different weight now, with everything they had lived between then and this moment. She knew he meant it fully. "Are you happy? Was it the right life? Was the choice I made for us the right choice? Is this what you would have chosen if you had chosen it for yourself?" She looked at him for a long moment, and her dark eyes held everything, the history and the years and the depth of a woman who had earned every word she ever said. "Hugh," she said, "I have been happy every single day." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something settled into the right place and fit completely. He reached across the space between the chairs and she put her hand in his, the way she had put her hand in his on the bank of the creek and over the white tablecloth and on the porch rail, and at 1,000 ordinary moments that had all been, in their own way, extraordinary. The prairie spread out before them in the last light, vast and particular, theirs and not theirs in the way that land belongs to the people who love it and work it and are made by it. The creek caught the last of the sun in the south quarter. The grass moved in the evening wind. The sky above Kansas went from gold to rose to the deep, clear blue that precedes the dark and the stars. They sat together as the light went down, and they were content. Everything they had built, everything they had chosen, everything that had come from one man making one decision to stay in the town where the woman he loved was living, sat around them and inside them and would go forward with the children they had raised, and the land they had tended, and the life they had made from a telegram refused, and a front yard conversation, and a ring with a garnet stone, and 20 years of showing up, honestly and completely, for each other. The best contract Hugh Sheridan had ever been offered, had not been the one that arrived by telegram from Wallace Granger in San Antonio in the summer of 1883. The best contract he had ever been offered was the unwritten one, offered and accepted in 100 small moments over 20 years, the one that said, "I am here, I choose this, I choose you." He had signed it the moment he put the coin on the telegraph counter and sent his refusal south. He had never regretted a single word.